While identifying and assessing the presence and impact of psychosocial hazards is essential, the recognition and management of the associated risk is just as important, since not all psychosocial hazards can be eliminated. We'll be having a conversation about risk and risk management up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each week, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk psychological health and safety. Welcome to this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Our goal for each episode is to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So when people hear the word risk, they tend to think about physical hazards and risk like chemicals, material that could catch on fire, slippery floors, faulty wiring, heavy machinery, those types of things. Interestingly, though, some people don't really have a fundamental understanding of what risk actually is. And without this understanding, it's kind of difficult to manage risk, whether it be physical or psychosocial, which is the risk we tend to talk about more in this conversation. So I thought it would be a value to have a conversation about risk. What is it? How can it be managed? And this knowledge can certainly help us when we think about how to manage it. Again, either when we're talking about physical or psychological or non-physical types of risks. So to have this conversation, I've invited someone who has a strong understanding of risk management, safety, a lot of other topics as well we might get into. And, as I said before we push the record button, we're going to go to school on risk. And we're going to start with an introduction of my guest, by my guest, with this question. Who is Lawanda Hall?
Hello, David. Thank you for having me on the show. That's a loaded question. Lawanda Hall is a Southern girl raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and very passionate about community and very much a thinker. And in the process of thinking and being really good at problem solving and numbers growing up, I was looking for something to do with those numbers. My mother was an accountant for the military and thought that I would be an accountant like her. She was an accountant for the Marines and then for the CDC in her career. And I looked at accounting and thought, that's interesting, but not quite tripping my triggers, right? And so I learned about statistical significance and decision science, now called quantitative analytics, and I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. So in 10th grade, I decided that I wanted to be in the industry that was responsible for quantifying all the things. And that industry at the time was largely risk management and insurance. Now, all companies are using this quantitative analytics to be able to, predict habits and to be able to make decisions around that. But at that time, it was largely risk management and insurance companies that were known for hiring such talents. So that's how I landed in a career in risk management and insurance. I attended Georgia State University, which is one of the top 3 programs in the country, and had a great experience there, majoring in risk management and insurance. And it has been the totality of my career. And I have no regrets because it is absolutely fascinating and interesting. I'm extremely passionate about the work and applying it not only to businesses, but looking at ways to apply it to community and apply it to culture and how society moves and works. It's a very intriguing discipline that I don't think gets enough credit and doesn't get enough reverence in the business community or in life in general. So, yes, that's who I am.
Okay. Wow. So before I dig further into that topic, I I'm going to ask you a question I ask everyone who comes on. And that question is, what does psychological health and safety mean to you?
Yes, for me, and I'm in the midst of reading your book, and I find it extremely, your perspective extremely fascinating. For me, I would simply say psychological safety is showing up with the capacity to express yourself freely. And that is important in all environments, work, life, because when you're impeded, when your expression is impeded, then there's something that doesn't get resolved, or there's something that doesn't get communicated properly in your experiences. And so expression is so important, because when you withhold, or when you need to tell something other than the truth, then the results are infected in some kind of way. And it's antithetical to freedom, and it's antithetical to evolution, and receiving a outcome that is correct, right? And correct not being necessarily aligned with your goals, but correct in you controlling the input in a pure way and getting an output in a pure way.
Hmm. 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 Okay. I I I found it interesting when you talked about a little bit about your background and who you are. The fact you said that your mother was an accountant. And now, as I think about how I've heard you alliterate, how you describe things, you sound like someone who's been in the presence of a linear sequential thinker. I mean, it does, you know, and we are all the product of our environment. And if we're in the presence of people who think in very, kind of concrete ways and think almost mathematically, then we tend to, that's who we are. If we are in the presence of people who are a little less structured, I'll say, we can kind of come across as kind of all over the place. And, some describe it as scattered. Some, I describe it as being more creative. But again, we're all kind of the product of those environments. And while one person might look at the analytical and the mathematical and go like, that's just not something I want to do. There are others who really are just fascinated by being able to dig into that thing. And you talked about the fact that, that the companies or the organizations who thought about this stuff in the past were more risk and insurance. So talk to me a little bit about that first opportunity that you got in risk and insurance. Was it risk and insurance, or was it where tell me a little bit about how, you actually got started in the profession?
So I was a non-traditional student. So again, I learned in high school about this possibility, and so I set my sights on this completely. And so a week after I graduated from high school, I got married. I don't recommend it. Uh, way too early. But anyway, so I got married. We, set up house, and I focused on helping my ex-husband set up his career. He was a firefighter who specialized in hazmat. And then when he stabilized himself in his career, then I went to school. While he was stabilizing himself in his career, I worked for State Farm and their claim litigation council in Atlanta under the leadership of Sharon W. Ware, who was an amazing woman, amazing attorney, and amazing mentor. And in that environment, my responsibility was a clerical one. And I also was very curious about the way the industry worked. And so I was surrounded with some amazing attorneys and paralegals and professionals who was patient with me enough to give me some insights and let me explore in that space. And also, State Farm had an amazing training program that did not limit itself to where you were in the organization. You could go to take all the classes as you signed up for them. And so that's what I did. I took a lot of classes at State Farm and ask a million questions to whoever would entertain them, right? And then once my ex-husband was stabilizing his career, I went to Georgia State University and matriculated through the risk management program. Now, post-graduation, my first opportunity was with AIG, where I was a claim litigation manager for commercial claims. And my territory was largely New York, but also Florida. And so I spent every day getting cursed out by New York attorneys every day. Yes, oh boy, every single day. And that was exhausting. And at the time, I thought it was interesting that I would come home just spent, just exhausted of 8 hours of just on the phone. And my ex-husband, who again is a firefighter, could not understand, why are you tired? You're sitting down all day. How are you exhausted? And so he was comparing the fact that he's running into burning buildings and running to, first responder on the calls to me sitting on the phone all day. And I was just like, no, you don't understand it. It is exhausting because every phone call is a problem to solve. Every phone call is somebody upset and pissed off. Every conversation is somebody cursing me out because they can't get their way, or they're trying to, gaslight me into getting their way when they, are wrong. Everything is a fight. And it was exhausting. Um, and he later called me after we were divorced. He later called and apologized because he ascended in his career to the point that he had a desk job, and he was just like, I've never been this kind of tired before in my life. He was like, I will trade running into a burning building any day over this kind of tired. And so we didn't have the language at the time. Thanks to you, we do have the language now. And I think he just understood that the psychological tired is just a different kind of tired than the physical tired. Physical tired, you can go home and take a nap and get some rest, right? Go get a massage, soak in some Epsom salt, and you're good. The psychological is tired. We don't necessarily have the tools in our everyday understanding of how you get over that, because before you can get over it, you're back in the game. The overnight rest and a good meal doesn't quell that psychological tired, and then you're back the next day and the next day and the next day, and it's just compounding and compounding and building. And it was I call my time at AIG like my boot camp experience of my career, because I felt like it was very, very difficult, and it prepared me for a career as a corporate risk manager, giving me understanding of all the things that I had to consider when placing the policies proactively as it related to the back end of how things could look once it became, if ever it became, an insurance claim. Um, and so it was interesting.
I honestly, I can't say I'd ever heard that story, but it makes so much sense. It sounds very familiar, and it's interesting how you describe the difference between the psychological tired and the physical tired, because it's so true. People go out and play sports and do lots of things that will physically kind of make you tired, physically almost exhaust you, but it doesn't feel psychologically bad. It feels like, oh, we had a great game. I scored a lot of points, whatever it is. And you can kind of almost bask in that. But the psychological tired is there's no place to go with that. I mean, if you're psychologically worn out, the physical part won't make that up. I mean, it just doesn't. They don't. That's the last reserve you have is in your mind, in your brain.
That's absolutely true. And I think, well, I don't think, based on my experience in the world of risk management and, claims, workers' compensation claims, and other claims, in the US, psychological injury is not considered except for as a result of a physical injury. It's not considered independently. Um, and people start talking about, workplace environment and things of that nature. So they're kind of swatting at it, but not really landing it where it needs to land. And so unless there's a physical injury, and the physical injury is causing the psychological injury, then there's not enough consideration given to psychological injuries, especially the fact that they can happen independent of a physical injury. I've never had a physical injury at a job. I have a desk job. I sit down, I talk on the phone, I'm on the computer. However, the psychological impact of being in an environment where you're not welcome, where people are intimidated, where people are attempting to, politicize positions instead of focusing on getting the work done. It's exhausting. It is exhausting. Um, in nearly 30 years of being in corporate and all the politics that happened when I left corporate, the way I felt, I couldn't quite describe it. And so I was, accessing the corner of my creative brain to think, is there such thing as corporate PTSD? Because I felt like if there was a such thing as that, I was experiencing it. Um, and I couldn't quite understand, the shift that I was experiencing in my psychosocial, psycho emotional cadence. And I Googled it and I actually found two books on corporate PTSD that a gentleman in Europe wrote and reached out to him. And a lot of things that was in his book resonated extremely deeply with what I was experiencing. And again, this is a non American that wrote the book because I don't think American safety professionals, risk management professionals, organizational management professionals really understand or gravitate towards the fact that there's there's injury at play that has nothing to do with a person's physical being.
Right, right. Yeah. The interesting thing about that reality is while we don't have the systems to recognize, to address, and to deal with, these experiences, we do have the personal experiences though, because I find it rare to run into someone who, once you describe, what you went through, I could describe what I went through. People who've never even met before, we could start talking about our experience of work, and we all have an experience like the one you talked about. We all have an experience of a level of exposure, again, exposure technically to a psychosocial hazard, but that causes me to feel a way that I don't want to feel. And it continues over and over and over again. Sometimes we have to almost normalize it to survive it. We have to tell ourselves that's just the way it is and convince ourselves, but we're hurting the entire time. We're feeling less, we're not at our best, but we just tell ourselves, well, this is what I have to do. And then the system tells you, well, it's not a physical thing. You'll be all right. Push through it. It'll get better. And often it doesn't get better. It doesn't get better.
It doesn't get better, and I've experienced and I've seen people do this in corporate settings at the job that I worked at the longest. Uh, there was a woman who would play gospel music at her desk all the time on like a low vibration where she could hear it. And then at lunchtime, she would put on her phone and she would just like blast gospel because that was her cloaking her psychology and cloaking her spirit so that she could just push through the day. Um, there were times when I would just sit in my car before going in my office and just listen to gospel music, on blast, again, to just cloak my spirit to prepare for the barrage of emotional terrorism that I was about to walk into in the office. And that's what it felt like, emotional terrorism. And I came up with that term as I was working at this place. I'm like, this is absolute emotional terrorism. And because I had a boss who um, was not very smart from a discipline perspective, but was very cunning from a people perspective. She should have been a politician. She really lost. She would have been a great politician. She could speak about nothing for hours and land and resolve nothing. But she had this way about um, manipulating people that was emotional terrorism. And it was absolutely exhausting because I'm the kind of person, as you mentioned with my mom, it's about the work, getting the work done. It's about focusing on the work. How can we get closer to complete on this objective? And so when people are not able to, some people who are emotional terrorists aren't able to access my emotion, they see it as a challenge to, oh, I'm going to get something out of her. And it's like, what you're going to get out of me is the work, and you're going to get focus and integrity. If I have an emotion attached to it, in my opinion, the workplace is not a place to open it up because I don't feel safe emoting in the workplace, particularly when you're with these type of personalities. And so it's just very interesting because these corporations don't run themselves; they're ran by people, and these people show up with complex layers of stuff. And some people only feel significant at work, and so they come and they're in these positions and they attempt to source all their significance in that place, because when they return home, there's no way to access significance. And often they do this at the expense of people who don't know their backgrounds, who don't understand, and who aren't even tied to anything that they've experienced in the past. But it becomes a dumping of, insignificance, and a dumping of, um, you know, all the things that they feel like they can't dump at home. And so then you have this toxic dumping ground where it significantly impedes the work from being done. Because I think most people have a good intention when they go to work to do the work, right? And then you're caught up in this headwind of stuff, of other people's stuff, in the emotional terrorism, where it makes it difficult, and the politics makes it difficult to get the work done. And I think smart companies should look at the headwinds of their organizations. What's stopping people from getting the work done? What's stopping people from showing up as their best self? You have a passionate employee who shows up wanting to, you know, play on the playground of their passion at your company. That's a beautiful gift. What's stopping them from being full throttle successful? And oftentimes it is other people who have other objectives or unresolved personal issues that they're looking to the workplace to resolve. And it's unfortunate, and it's costing companies productivity, time. At the end of the day, we're all in business to make money. It's costing them money, a significant amount of money. And for being in an industry that quantifies all the things, right? Um, it's interesting that we have not quantified how the psychosocial and the psychological injury impacts the bottom line in American businesses.
So tell me, again, since this has been an area of study for you for a while, what is the kind of classic definition of risk? Because what you talked about some of these things, and I would describe them as the hazard. They're kind of the source of this, this thing happens and it puts off something on people that cause them not to feel safe and not to be able to be their best self and not be able, but it comes from something. And the emissions from that, I believe, are risk. That's what I believe. I think they are. But help me. What is risk for people who don't really know what it is? What is risk?
So to keep it simple, risk as a standalone term is the probability of an outcome, right? And we think about the probability of an outcome, we all take all kind of risk every day. You walk out your door, whether you put in a seatbelt or not, whether you wear a certain type of shoes or not, if your feet gonna hurt 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, kind of thing. We all are playing with risk every single day, every single choice that we make. So it's the probability of an outcome, one way or another, right? Um, the interesting thing about risk management, though, as a discipline, is the proactive management of the probability of an outcome, right? Because it is a proactive. We're not reactive. If we're responding, you need a crisis manager is a responding type of thing. Risk management is designed to be proactive, and so you are looking at all the tools and all the possibilities for the outcome for whatever entity you're managing risk for, and saying, okay, how can we get in front of this so that we prevent as much as we can from it happening, put controls in place and things. But if it does happen, because stuff happens, we live in life. If it does happen, how can we mitigate and keep it from being detrimental to the company? How can we keep it from costing way more than we want it to cost? How can we keep it from costing, lives and money and reputation and all the different, areas of risk considerations? And so I think, risk by itself, that's that play for everybody. But risk management as a discipline is about, engaging in proactive problem solving to mitigate the outcomes, the adverse outcomes of risk. So you want to mitigate the adverse outcomes of risk, but risk is, twofold. You want to amplify the upside of risk, right? So it's not just, doom and gloom and keeping things from happening. It's also making sure that when there's opportunity, that we're amplifying that top side so that the companies can grow and evolve in a sustainable way, and that we're not losing anything more than is in the appetite of the organization to lose.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Like most folks, to me, risk gets mentioned most often, at least I hear it mentioned most often, in terms of predicting a potentially harmful outcome. How do we avoid a potential harmful outcome? But I heard you mention that this is managing the probability of things happening. That includes enhancing the potential of a healthy outcome. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's actually both. Like I said,
Absolutely.
it gets described in the negative, but there's some positive things to it if you take a kind of a holistic approach. The other thing about risk in general, when I, am around risk management folks, I tend to hear a lot more about risk management as it relates to the entity, to the organization, and not as much about risk to the human beings. So talk to me a little bit about that different kind of focus, because they're both important. I mean, if you so, I've recently been toying with this idea that there's a difference between a business and an employer. And often the reason why these businesses don't do well is our crappy employers. They have great business idea, but when the humans get involved in it, they don't focus the same amount of energy on making sure that the humans are healthy and safe and taken care of and all that. And so consequently, that impacts the business idea, because unless you're going to use robots, if you're going to use robots, no biggie, because robots don't have emotions. They are ones and zeros.
Right.
But so talk to me a little bit about the difference, the focus on risk as it relates to an organization and the risk as it relates to the human beings.
That's interesting because in my world, I like to take the whole person approach. And because, I have to remind myself every day that problem solving is a skill and not everyone possesses that skill. And so if you're looking at problem solving, you're not looking to solve it one time. You're looking to solve it systemically and sustainably. If you are truly a problem solver, right? Because otherwise, it's busy work to solve the problem over and over and over again. And I don't subscribe to that because it's inefficient, and it's antithetical to evolutionary growth in an organization. And so I said before, these companies don't run themselves, right? A company cannot run itself. Even with a robot, you need somebody to program the robot. You need somebody to lubricate the robot. You need someone to maintain the robot and replace chips and all the things, right? So even with a body of robots, you still need a human touch and engagement. And so the fact that companies do look at risk from an organization perspective, separate from a people perspective, in my opinion, is a big problem. Because if all the people that you're hiring are designed to focus on the company risk, and no one's job is to focus on the people and their risk to make sure that they're okay, then you're just going to be churning people and getting new people over and over again, and out the door goes so much intellectual capital, organizational capital, brand, capital, understanding of how it's growing, and that costs the company more long term than it saves them. So you may be getting the work done, but big picture, it's just not sustainable, in my opinion. And so, yes, the risk manager's job, HR's job, all of these, disciplines' job is to work on behalf of protecting and safeguarding the organization's brand, the organization's money, the organization, in general. And the people factor, and you know this because I've heard you speak about it, and I learned some things from you. The people factor in a lot of U.S. organizations is based on laws that are put in place through, safe working environments, workers' compensation laws, and these kind of things. So the question is to ask ourselves, if these laws were not in place for organizations to focus on people, would they even care enough to focus on people? Because oftentimes you'll see organizations will do only what the law requires them to do and nothing more, right? They will have workers' compensation, they will put the signs up, they will post the signs, but they're just checking the box on the law. And that's different than having a blended culture of consideration to say, we actually care about our people and we want to consider their experience in this space. And so that there's a symbiotic relationship versus they're just here to work for us. And then we have to also understand in the US, right, wrong, or indifferent, and I have no emotion attached to this, but it's just a matter of fact that all work and success is tied to the initial success of the company of this country, and that was tied to the plantations of this country. And so a lot of work designs are, some version of that. The titles have changed, the words have changed, but the impetus has not changed. We want to be successful, and it doesn't matter if it costs people, life, limb, and psychosocial health. We don't care. We just want to be successful and make the money, right? And so I call that echoes from the plantations. And these echoes that happen in corporations and these echoes that happen in our society and in other ways are loud and prevalent. And there's a group of people who feel like they can't do nothing about it. And this is not a black and white thing, to be clear. It's not, racially driven, because the people who own and the people who work all look, differently these days. And so the workers are subject to this treatment regardless of, their background. And I think that is interesting. And at a couple of jobs, tongue in cheek, people would, people who are contributors, individual contributors, would call the job the plantation, right? And tongue in cheek. And again, not just black folks, like everybody said, oh, we got to go to the plantation, right? Kind of thing. Though it was a tongue in cheek expression, it's the echoes and the energy is similar. And because that model has yielded financial success, no one is going to say, let's do something different, or let's do something, unless that something different can be proven to make more money, because the focus is on money and not people.
I would, and I absolutely, I'm vibing with the conversation we're having. I got to tell you, I believe that every system is perfectly designed to produce whatever it is currently producing. And these systems that were put in place while this country was growing, while it was, this country got humongously rich off of the work of Africans, of the Chinese, of folks from Ireland, pick your group of people who were often either brought to this country or raised in this country to feed the machine itself. That's it. And again, a lot of these decisions were made based on doing a primary thing, which is make money. The human beings were secondary. They're kind of, I guess they're necessary. But if we could find a mule and we use a mule. But people tend to be able to produce money a little bit better. I want to believe that there is a shift going on in terms of just how we see ourselves as a species, that people are becoming less and less and less interested in a system that is set up primarily to make money, but it's going to harm me in the process. More people are starting to go like, hold up. I'm not sure if I like that. I'm not sure if I want to be engaged in that. I'm not sure if I want to be a part of that kind of thing. It's pushing the boundaries of how we think about how these organizations should be set up. And as I said before, people have great business ideas, but when they use the employment ideas from the past, and that's where the plantation stuff, that was the employment system. It was basically a system to get work out of people, but not to compensate them for their work. Some of that still goes on. We just now call it low wage workers. We now call it, people from other countries. But the same kind of system, as a matter of fact, some of the studies I'd done a while ago, the cost to buy a human being in 1860 is, if you convert it to current dollars, is somewhere under $60,000. Because most people had to get, not everybody, a lot of people never owned slaves and all that, but to buy a human being really it had a cost. But if you look at the average wage that people make in this country, it's not that high. So I would suggest that we have a system right now that actually is almost slavery by another name, because we have people who are toiling away at 3 jobs and can't find a place to live and can't feed their family and all that type of thing. But their employers control when they show up and when they go home and where they live. So it's, some of the same underlying, it is making money for someone, but it is harming people in the process. And like I said, I think there's a generation of people, where I'm going with this is, and you're involved in helping I know you do some work with students and such, trying to help them kind of understand this whole risk management kind of concept. So I believe that people's minds are changing around that type of thing. They're going like, hold up, I'm not sure I want to do that. So am I off or?
No, I don't think you're off. I think the people whose minds are changing are the people who are subject to the low wages, right? Because again, you have owners and you have individual contributors. And the individual contributors are saying, you know what, this is crazy. Why am I continuing to subject myself to this situation and it's not benefiting me? And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a shift happening. And it is interesting because there's been quiet resistance, and now there's and now the resistance is not so quiet. So you've heard quiet quitting, you've heard of the mass exodus of women leaving the workforce because they're just tired of being the workhorses in these organizations and then not getting credit or advancements as a result of it, and these kinds of things. So I absolutely agree that there's an evolution of thought thinking, and in the whole season of everybody wants to be a boss. If we think big picture, that's not sustainable either, because who's going to do the work if everybody's a boss, right? And you can't find people to work for you. And so I think eventually it will right size to the point where we have to, sit together and come up with a fair and equitable way of exchanging ideas, services, work in an ethical way and in a way that is integral. And as it relates to you saying, the wages and the people that buy, my perspective is similar, but I'm gonna give you this. So entertain me for a second, because my mind works in numbers. You're quantifying all the things. So if you think about slavery, to your point, you buy people for a particular cause, but then after you buy them, let's just say it wasn't free labor, because even though they didn't get paid a check in hand, they had housing, they had food, they had clothes, they had the bare minimum to get the work done, right? They had, something. And so it cost the owners something to maintain their workforce, right? They called them slaves at the time. Now they're calling them the workforce. It cost them something. So if you think about the percentage that they may have spent of their revenue on maintaining their workforce, what percentage would you think that would cost them, right? So think about housing, clothes, whatever they needed to stay healthy to do the work. What percentage would you throw out there?
20, 30%. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
And right. And that's what I want you to just guess, 20, 30%. Now, if you go and look at publicly traded companies, public information, if you look at their 10Ks and you look at their annual reports and you see how much they're spending on workforce, all in, including benefits and, salaries and all the things, right? Bonuses, all the structures, and you take that as a percentage of their overall revenue for the year, you would be amazed at what that percentage actually is, right? And I did this for the publicly traded companies that I work for, and I was just like, oh, wow, that's interesting. One company I worked for, it was less than 2%.
No,
One, two,
seriously.
less than 2%. Less than 2%. Another company I looked at and I was just like, oh, I think it was like less than 10%. So you would think, oh, 20-30% to maintain and you're making all this money. No. And so again, it is the same model. If you look at the percentages, if you look at, how business works, if you look at the numbers and the bottom lines and all these things, what we're experiencing now is actually financially less beneficial than slavery. It's financially less beneficial. Yeah, which is why you're saying people working 2 or 3 jobs, they're not able to make the money. And this is, in my opinion, is intentional, because the system is not designed for everybody to be wealthy. Because if you think about, a pyramid, the people at the top have 2 jobs: to keep the bottom densely populated so that they can create stability, so that they can stay on top and stay in their position, right? And if you keep the bottom densely populated for your own stability, that means that you have to make decisions and you have to manage things in a way that keeps them poor, that keeps them on the bottom of the pyramid, right? So that you remain comfortable, you and your family remain comfortable at the top of the pyramid. And that's what's at play. And oftentimes, I think keeping people busy keeps them from stopping to do these analyses that are necessary, for evolution. And so, in my opinion, the gift of the pandemic was that people had time. I could sit back, I could think about this, I had time, I could analyze it, I could have a different experience and compare what I'm feeling in my body and in my being to what I was feeling before. And so now everybody's saying, oh, you got to come back to work. And people are saying, no, I'm not coming back to work. They're literally fighting for their lives because they now understand that, oh, I don't have to be subjected to the political manure that happens in corporate and the emotional terrorism that happens in corporate in order to be a productive contributor to this organization. But those people who are searching for significance, who feel like they need to have someone to terrorize in the office in order to feel good about themselves, are the group of people who are saying, oh, you got to come back to work. Because none of the statistics indicate that people working from home are doing less work or being less productive. It quite frankly shows the opposite, right? It shows the opposite. Like, they're still getting the work done. And so, but they want you back in the office because of, in my opinion, their psychosocial toxicity. They can't spew it onto themselves, so they need somebody else to aggravate. And so, because otherwise, like, why would you want to spend multiple $1 million on real estate if you don't have to as an organization, right? And so money is at play, but from the owner's perspective, there's a interesting psychology that's attached to their ego and their position of power that is also at play.
Wow. So before we wrap this up, I want to go into a little bit of detail about some of these efforts that you're involved in around helping the next generation of risk managers be prepared for what they're going into, be better armed, be just kind of understand what the whole risk management game is about. So talk to me a little bit about some of the work that you're doing with students and with other folks that are trying to learn the risk management game.
Right. So I'm extremely passionate about this discipline, and I always want to speak to young people and speak life to them as they are evolving into this space, and speak to the whole person. And so I connect with Spencer Foundation, which is an amazing organization that provides scholarship and funding to students who are interested in the discipline of risk management and insurance, and talking to students about career opportunities in risk management and insurance so that they can go in with more clarity than I did than I had when I went into the industry. So they go in with some clarity and understanding the possibilities and the opportunities. Right. I'm working directly with Southern University, which is an HBCU in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They will be the only HBCU with the risk management and insurance program, and their classes for that program starts in 2 weeks. I'm very excited about that. Um, and so I'm working with them to help them understand not just, the vocabulary lesson, right, that you learn in school, but also the career connection opportunities and the and coaching the students to help them understand, closed mouths don't get fed. You have to speak up for yourself and some of the softer skills around being an astute professional. And so I'm extremely passionate about that. Also, risk management on campus is a program that Spencer manages, and universities invite risk managers to come on campus and speak to students about careers and to speak to them about the possibilities, which are endless, in this world. And so I will be in Bowie to speak to those students in September. And then I have a few other schools that have invited me to connect with them to stand up their risk management programs in a thoughtful way. And these are not just many of them are HBCUs, but they're also traditional schools or predominantly white schools that are inviting me in. Because for me, I'm passionate about the discipline. Um, where the person is, in their race and all that doesn't matter. I was in Chicago in May, and I was surrounded by students from everywhere, from Europe and Africa and America and all the things. And I spoke life to all of them equally, and understanding that this next generation, which I think is going to teach us, they are teaching us and will continue to teach us more about how to access and spend your freedom in a real way, in a more thoughtful way. So I just love the energy and the light in this next generation. And so they are absolutely amazing. And I speak life to them because I think who they are and their lived experiences, and the intersection of that in the risk management and insurance world is going to be amazing, because I think risk management has the opportunity, the discipline has the opportunity to lead corporations in the direction of a more integral and in a more fair play as it relates to how it treats its people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, if again, thank you so much for all that you've shared about just risk in general, about the risk management field, and then a little bit about some of the efforts involved in trying to make the field, trying to make it better for the next generation. Because I think often the one of the contributing factors as to why these systems don't get better is that people go through them, experience them, and then leave them the same way that they were when they got there. And nothing is perfect, but I think it can certainly get better if we're able to say, look, this part didn't really work for me, and I have some ideas about how this could be better. It may not, again, not looking for perfection, but looking for it to be better and to be more helpful and to be more healthy for folks as they attempt to exercise the gifts that they've been given in this arena. Just so before we close, if folks want to learn more about, they might have more questions. You have your own way of sharing these, conversations with people. So talk a little bit about how people might get a hold of you and learn more about just risk management, insurance, those kinds of concepts in general, and how you might be able to help them.
Yeah, so my company is Intelligent Intentions, and I provide it's a boutique consulting firm that I provide consulting for small businesses on risk management to help them scale and grow and connect to larger organizations in a risk responsible manner. And I also do consulting, like you said before, to help the next generation and usher them into the discipline in a responsible manner as well. So you can reach me. My favorite playground is LinkedIn online. And so LinkedIn is the best way to reach me, Lawanda Michelle Hall. You can also reach me directly on my website under the Let's Talk link on intelligentintentions.com. And I look forward to connecting and speaking with your audience about all things risk, whether it be career aspirations from school or from transitioning, or whether it be risk management consulting to help smaller businesses do bigger, better business in a sustainable and risk responsible manner.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Hopefully those of you who are listening who have, because there is no environment that is totally free of risk. It just doesn't exist. And again, as you mentioned before, it's about, managing the outcomes that we want to see. How do we get ourselves closer to the kind of outcomes that we want to see and kind of avoid the ones that we don't? So that's a proactive type activity. And it's good to hear you talk about risk management in kind of a proactive way. I think it's really important. So, for those who might be watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something you've heard will bring you back to a future episode. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. You can watch, like, subscribe, and share the podcast on the Flourish DX YouTube page. And you can join the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting and becoming a subscriber on LinkedIn. So until next time, stay tuned and look out for the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Tune in each week for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.